Good morning and good afternoon. My name is Kathleen Regan, and I'd like to welcome you all to a LexisNexis complimentary CLE accredited webinar titled Contracting in a World of Data Breaches and Insecurity, Managing Third-Party Vendor Engagements. Before I introduce our speakers, I have a few announcements about today's event. For our phone participants only, if a problem arises during the program, dial *0 for the operator. And for continuing education purposes, those parties listening by phone only, please be sure that you have identified yourself with the operator. If your name has not been taken, please dial *0 now, and an operator will take your information. Those audience members listening via computer do not need to identify themselves with an operator. In order to process your CLE credit, please download and complete the Contracting in a World of Data Breaches and Insecurity form you will find via the gray CLE widget in the bottom dock of your webcast console. Please promptly return those forms as instructed within them to the LexisNexis CLE team. We suggest downloading these materials shortly after the program begins. All New York attorneys will receive a more specific form following this event. Please consult your local rules for further guidance on CLE or contact LexisNexis at cle@lexisnexis.com. All attorneys joining us today will be given 2 4-digit codes randomly announced throughout today's call. Please be ready at all times to write these codes down so you may enter them on the appropriate CLE paperwork. These codes are required to receive your credits and verify your active participation in today's call. You must attend the entire event in order to receive these codes. Again, all CLE material can be downloaded via the gray CLE widget in the bottom dock of your webcast console. Today's panelists welcome your questions. You may submit your questions via the Q&A tab of the webinar platform throughout our program. The panelists will try to address as many audience questions that are submitted through the tab as possible during the last few minutes of the program. Please keep in mind all questions may not be answered due to time constraints. We will not be taking questions over the phone lines and will only receive questions through the web portion of the program via the Q&A window. And now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Complete biographies are included with today's PowerPoint. David Katz is a partner in Nelson Mullins Riley & Scarborough's Atlanta office, where he leads the Privacy and Information Security Practice Group. He counsels clients on the development, management, and oversight of privacy and compliance programs. Mr. Katz also assists them in developing policies and procedures, education strategies, implementation of auditing and monitoring controls, reviews of disciplinary and enforcement activities, and risk assessments. Linda Clark is Senior Counsel for Data Security and Compliance at Reed Elsevier Group, a world-leading provider of professional information solutions. Ms. Clark acts as lead counsel to Reed Elsevier's Information Assurance and Data Protection Organization and provides expert guidance on data security and privacy safeguards and frameworks for compliance with state and federal legal and regulatory obligations. Prior to joining Reed Elsevier, Ms. Clark was a litigator with a large law firm in New York City, handling complex civil litigation and arbitration. Jorge Ray is the Director of Information Security and Compliance at Kaufman, Rawson & Company, one of the largest independent accounting firms in Florida and one of the top 100 CPA firms in the country. Recognized by the South Florida Business Journal as one of top professionals under the age of 40, he is responsible for managing and performing a variety of information security assessments and service organization controls reports for companies in the financial services, healthcare, and technology industries. Mr. Ray helps organizations ranging from startups to large public and privately held companies address information security, compliance, and IT needs. Before we begin today, I would like to announce today's first CLE code. Attendees, please note, the first CLE code for today's webinar is 2507. Again, the first CLE code for today's webinar is 2507. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. It's really my great pleasure to be with everyone listening on the call today, and it's also my pleasure to be with Linda and Jorge, 2 experts in this area. And today we're going to be talking about this topic that is getting a lot of attention and is the subject of many discussions within legal departments and corporations across the country. This process involves quite a number of people, and what we hope to do today is try to create a framework for you to be able to begin to have these discussions within your own organization and to give you a roadmap overview of the concept, and to give you enough good information that you can go back within your own companies and your own departments and begin to discuss how to manage and establish a vendor management program. So with that, I'd like to get to the first topic and give you a brief overview of where we're going in this presentation and walk you through at a high level the first 10 topics as we begin to go through the presentation together. First, what we're going to be talking about is the case for vendor management, and we'll give you an overview and explain why are we talking about this topic, what are the things to consider, and how do you build an argument to be able to go back within your own organization and explain to management and anyone in a decision-making position of why this process is so important. Next, we're going to define what is vendor management. The key to understanding any process and any concept is really to get a good definition. And we're going to raise some questions that help define this process and explain it. Next, we're really going to give an overview of the risks. And we're going to talk about the bad and the scary, about why this program is important and what can happen if it's not properly developed. Next, we're going to talk about the stakeholders in vendor management. Who owns this program? And anyone that's been involved in a corporation is used to asking that question and used to answering that question of who owns this, who's going to lead this development, and who's responsible. The next area that we're going to discuss is the process for governing vendor management. How should this process be governed? There are a lot of moving parts, and there are people involved throughout a company as part of this process. And what happens if folks don't necessarily agree as part of the vendor management process in vetting vendors, and how does this get resolved? Next, we're going to talk about integration without disruption and talk about experiences in championing this program and how to do it consistent with what the business needs are and in a way that does not become disruptive or chaotic. We're going to give an overview of vendor management and legal compliance and talk about some of the contractual considerations and some of the components from a statutory perspective that are necessary when drafting these agreements. And finally, we're going to give an overview of the audit perspective and what do these SOC reports mean, how are they used, and how do they become involved in outsourced operations. And that's a very important component to this is the audit piece. We're going to be talking about cloud risks, and finally we're going to give you a good tight overview of the practical takeaways from the presentation. So our first slide is really the case for vendor management, and these elements incorporate all of the things that you would really need to understand as part of presenting your own case back to management about how this process should be organized and why it's important. Linda, would you talk just for a second about the components of a good vendor management program and who the individuals should be that become involved in vendor management within the organization?
Sure. I mean, the short answer is you want everyone involved who could be a touch point to making a decision about vendors in terms of vendor selection, everyone who could make a contribution about the risks that might be associated with vendor selection and the engagement of vendors, and then those individuals who would be a part of the process to make any exceptions. So it's really a risk assessment, a governance model, and an understanding of the way the business functions. And the goal should be to bring some standardization to that process. I mean, what I just laid out is a whole host of people and a whole host of considerations. So the key is to try to get the buy-in, get people to understand that vendors can be seen as an extension of your entity, and to establish what the risk tolerance will be and how things can be objectively assessed, and then what compensating controls can be built in for an assessment. And I think as you work through that process, it's important to be mindful of people out there like Jorge, your auditors, right, who are going to come in and take an objective look and determine if your vendor management process has been handled appropriately. So if you think about the things that are going to be tested, it helps you get to a point of understanding how to be prepared for that, and that the testing mechanism really is a mature model that has baked in the considerations that you should be mindful of as well.
And I think it's important to note also that there are other departments that have ownership of this. I mean, this is really a function of both legal, the risk management group, and also the privacy and information security components of an organization and those individuals. So it really covers multiple departments. And as part of making this case about why this process is important, a second thing that has to be understood is really understanding how data flows in and out of a company, because that's ultimately what will be the issue that needs to be resolved in terms of who has access to the information and what kind of rights they're given and how those flows occur in order to properly evaluate the risk. Can you talk for a second about just the governance model and how you've seen that set up and how you've seen it be effective in terms of governing this process just a little bit?
Right. I mean, the goal of the governance model is to start with a wide audience where you value and solicit and incorporate contributions from all different stakeholders. David, to your point, that might be risk management, it might be vendor management if that's a separate group, it might be compliance. Of course, security is going to be at the table, legal is going to be at the table, and that presumes that you have a large organization. You know, in some organizations, that may be one or two people. But you start with the contributions coming in, identifying the risks, identifying potential candidates for vendor management, identifying questions that you want to ask. And then with your governance model, those different working groups, so to speak, would filter up their contributions to a senior setting, which would then in turn filter it up to the ultimate decision maker. And it may be that different steps of that governance model are only implicated if you're working through your exceptions process. So it may be that there's a risk that's not a typical risk, and you need to determine if that's something that is a risk that can be tolerated through your governance model. And the key throughout those steps is to identify and document the compensating controls, if appropriate, that you're relying on to undertake that risk. Or if you're not making an exception, to still document in a very objective way why you are comfortable with this vendor, how you're going to be continuing to be comfortable with that vendor, so an audit function, so to speak, and what representations have been made to you from that vendor from a legal perspective in case there is a failure at some point.
Excellent. So really, the overview of this slide is really to create that initial outline of things that you need to sort of have a handle on before you're really promoting the adoption of this program. It gives you these bullet points or things that you'd really need to have established and kind of understood and have thought through as you're going to folks that have the ability to sort of organize all of these different players and bringing them together to get aligned to create a program like this. I guess, Jorge, if you want to talk just for a second about some of the other considerations relative to policies and just give the audit perspective when you're seeing organizations that have adopted kind of vendor management policies and just sort of what you think about that.
Absolutely. So in order for the vendor management program to work, you definitely need to have a standard process. That means that policy and procedures need to be formal and they need to be followed. So when we come and we do the audit of a vendor management program, that's the first piece that we're looking for. Is this a process that's being repeated more than once? Are you being consistent with the way you're assessing your risks? And we look for evidence in management's activities to establish that. Are you really in compliance with your own policies and procedures? So it is a very, very critical part of the process. It is who is responsible for making sure that the policies are being enforced. Who does these governance team report to? And when we do the audits, that's the way we're trying to accomplish is just get that communication across.
Sure, very good. So Linda, just in terms of internal employees and sort of getting these policies out and getting them drafted and even maybe with customers, how have you seen that done effectively from your perspective?
I think there's two ways. I mean, there needs to be the first part of the communication, which is the document you're going to use to gather your information from the vendor. And then the second part of the process is the evaluation. And it likely is that you have similar stakeholders in the development and then the assessment, but with additional groups added on. So there's some overlap, but there may be some different competencies that you expect to have there. And in the questionnaire portion, you have to be mindful that is going to be something that will be addressed to a third party. Yes, they may be subject to a confidentiality agreement, but then the separate part, the assessment that you do internally, may be something that you undertake in a privileged context at the direction of counsel. And the output of those different, of the assessment that you perform Again, you want to be mindful of the fact that there may be something you need to be able to present to auditors or to customers who may be entrusting you with information that you are passing to a vendor, and the fact that you may also need to maintain some privileged information behind the scenes if you're doing this for a regulatory compliance undertaking or to make sure you're abiding by separate legal obligations. But I think you want competencies that we've spoken about before, someone from IT, someone from your legal group, competencies that represent the typical framework of administrative, physical, and technical controls with people who are mindful of privacy and security obligations and governance models.
Great. So the next slide is really we want to start to talk about what is this concept and who are the components of a vendor management process. How do these individual departments begin to cooperate? What should the cooperation level be? What are they trying to identify and mitigate as the risks when involving third parties? And how are they working in unison? And what's the collaboration level like within the organization? And then, how is this right-sized and scaled to the organization? And what are the functions of these individual groups? So the objective is for these groups to work together because the reality within an organization is that not every contract may flow through legal. Legal may not know of every contract that's coming through. And IT may have something separate that it's done. And in a perfect world, they would all flow through the legal department. But the objective is with all of these components working in unison, there shouldn't be within an organization something to slip through the cracks that's gone unidentified. And so, as this risk landscape and the regulatory environment evolves, it's really important that the leadership in these groups work together and in unison to collaborate on a process that's calibrated to the organization, that's credible, methodical, and defensible, that can determine the acceptable risk level to the organization. And I would submit that not any one of these groups should alone determine these things, that this should be an in-concert group of decision makers that work together to evaluate risk and have this process be successful. Linda or Jorge, do you want to comment sort of on that?
I think that's right. I think you go back to the fundamental idea that people need to get that this is a serious extension of your security program. You need the buy-in at the beginning to make sure you're standing up to the decisions that you need to make at the end.
Jorge, did you want to maybe give an example of something you've seen and maybe in a cloud computing context?
Yes, absolutely. So many times what we've seen out there is depending on how big the organization is, a lot of these functions they're going to rely more on outsourced counsel or the auditors or consultants. The larger the organizations, they're going to have more of these staffs internally. And definitely one of the areas that we're seeing is tone at the top. Is the CEO involved at these decisions? Is the board of directors understanding what are the risks? And those are the questions that we need to make sure they're being answered.
Linda, how have you seen these groups align and work together, in organizations that you've dealt with, either on your side or as the vendor or with the customer? Have you had any experience to see how these groups have functioned together?
I think that is going to be organization specific, but to your point, you want to identify that up front. So you could make a roles and accountability chart that shows who's going to be responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, and who is informed of the decisions, both in terms of the groups that are brought in and then the specific individuals. But you also want to make sure that the organization that's making the decisions retains some independence, so that when the auditors come in to test it, there is objectivity and there's also the ability to push back. So you want to be working in concert with the business, mindful of the business needs, but you also have to have a documented process that accounts for risks and is willing to push back if necessary.
Very good. And I think it's also important to point out that it's just very unlikely within an organization that someone in one of these individual business units could engage a third party and it not come onto the radar of one of the other groups within this series of individuals, because oftentimes there's going to be some relationship just by virtue of the vendor engagement between one of these groups. So if everybody understands from the beginning that if something comes through that involves access to data or the transfer of data, that automatically it should involve the notification of the other. And really, I think, Jorge, you made this point. I mean, really where this begins and how it should be communicated are to the internal business owners as part of some good training and good education, and maybe part of when you make your case for why this program is important, to explain very carefully and very closely the roles of each of these individuals as part of the process. The other thing is, if you're in an organization where you haven't been able to quite get the spark to formalize this program, it's really important that maybe you reach out to the leadership in some of these departments, align and try and work this together to get the most amount of buy-in and momentum as possible. And IT is certainly a good partner for that, because they, in most instances, are going to be controlling access. And so if they're properly aligned and understand the risks, they can be a fantastic ally in sort of championing this program and getting the buy-in within your organization. Any follow-up to that or comment on that?
Yeah, many times what we're seeing a lot of times in organizations is that they're making decisions regarding cloud computing. They can go out there and set up their own cloud services as a software, and many times they're not necessarily companies following their vendor management process. So that is something that a lot of companies need to be looking for. It is who is out there from your cloud computer vendors, what type of services are being provided, and how's your data being transferred to them.
That's a great point. And I mean, in some organizations, if they have a well-organized procurement function and they have the centralization of all agreements, and then this process becomes much easier. But in smaller organizations where things are decentralized and you may have a department head that has contracting authority, it becomes more challenging. And that's a good example of where someone may just be able to go out and off the shelf purchase some software that could potentially impact the entire organization, and nobody in the right roles may be the wiser. So I think that's a very good point to make. And to the extent that organizations can utilize some of the infrastructure that's already in place from a contracting standpoint, then they may have a much easier time in sort of addressing some of these issues. So now the topic that everybody likes because it can be scary, or what are the risks? What happens if you can't establish an appropriate vendor management program? And Jorge, do you want to start with this topic, being an auditor?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of times we're always reading about all the different data breaches that are occurring, and primarily a lot of these data breaches are occurring at third-party providers. So it's not necessarily your organization, but a vendor that has your data. So that is a critical process when you're looking at vendors, is what type of data they have that it's yours, and what is the risk to that data. Is it confidentiality? If it's integrity? Is it privacy? And those are the questions you need to start asking yourself to determine what is the risk that that vendor is posing to you.
Good. So, Linda, what are your thoughts on sort of the risks and how those are managed from your perspective?
I think the starting point is least access necessary. So when you look at a vendor and you have a proposal to engage somebody, you look at whether or not they actually need the access, which would be creating some kind of technical barrier to a breach or misuse, and then mitigating any access that you're going to allow them by contractual obligations, such as background screening, periodic recertifications, things of that nature. So I think you build it in on two levels. You limit any access people are going to have as much as possible, and then you address the access that will be granted by ensuring that it's not overstepping. And I think regardless of what decisions you make up front, you have to revisit those on a periodic basis. There may be changes to the particular vendor. There may be changes to the law. There may be lessons learned internally. So it's not a static process. And on an ongoing basis, you need to keep revisiting those decisions and looking not just for, as I said, the legal controls, but the technical ways that you can, belt and suspenders that approach.
And I just want to quickly run through these bullet points because I think they're important for consideration. If you have an established good vendor control, you run the risk of losing some ownership rights to your data, not having that security, there not being any privacy. The lack of protection and controls, there being the inability to get backup and recovery, it may be inappropriate or complete. And this is a point that I think is often missed, that vendor management may be more about just access from the electronic perspective to systems and servers, that there's a physical security component to vendor management as well. And Linda, would you like to comment on that?
Sure. One of the things that we had talked about in preparing for this presentation was that a lot of people tend to think about vendor management in the context of electronic information, and that you need to take a broader approach in looking at who your vendors are. It may be on-site cleaning personnel. It may be your document shredding company. And so it may not be someone that you typically think of as someone who has access. So I always suggest continuing to go back to that model of administrative, physical, and technical safeguards and how these vendors may interact with any of those controls. So physical security, for example, you may not think of them as having access to the data, but if you go through the different steps of how they interact with your organization, it may be that they're walking the floors of the building and there may be documentation that they have access to. So to not think of it only in the electronic context, I think is very important, especially for organizations that handle more sensitive information, whether it's protected health information or things of that nature where you have obligations specific to paper and electronic records, as well as understanding that vendors themselves, the corporate entity, the vendor may have a certain representation they make, but that you want to peel back the layers of that onion and look at the individuals who will be assigned to you and what standards you set for those particular individuals who will have interaction with your data. So vendors may establish tiers of personnel that are deployed, so to speak, for certain engagements, and to really make sure that those tiers sync up with the type of access you are giving them and the type of access that they will necessarily need to have as part of that engagement with you.
Jorge, I'm interested in your perspective on sort of the right sizing of this physical security piece, because I can hear, the question coming, well, we just have these guys or companies in once a week to do some cleaning in our retail location and ensure we have company files, but do we really need to lock them up under some very complex vendor management agreement where they're making representations about security features they might use in their business? I mean, I guess what's the audit sort of perspective around that in terms of scoping and scale and risk?
So the audit approach is, what is your risk? And when you're looking at the vendors, you're going to have different levels of risk. You're going to be having high, medium, and low. And are you going to be putting this vendor in a low, medium, or high? And it all depends on how the organization defines vendor management and their criteria for handling the vendors. Now, on the specific case you're giving, you're certainly going to be making sure that at least you have some type of contractual agreement in which they're doing background checks for their employees. Their business is a business. They're coming into your building, and you want to make sure that they're protecting the data the same way you're protecting your data. So if you're running background checks on your employees, you might want to extend that to your vendor.
Excellent. So the other, components to this are, loss of the data if the vendor fails financially, a really important component in terms of who you're giving the information with. It's maybe not so much a privacy and security concern, but the other element underlying a lot of this is in many cases an organization's data is their intellectual property. And so if you start to begin to think of data like cash, and how it should be protected in the same way and how it has value in the same way, you want to be increasingly careful about how it's dispersed. The incident response, a vendor not having a good handle on that can also cause a lot of damage, brand erosion, collapse, And so you need to understand the relative sophistication of your vendor to deal with a data breach and a loss. How are those elements going to be communicated? Have you properly evaluated the vendor's ability to communicate if something like that happens? And the problem is, if you haven't properly vetted that third party, when the breach does happen, the finger is going to come back and be pointed solely at you because it's your information. And unfortunately, you're not going to be able to say, oh, it was their fault, because I think the consuming public, and certainly from a regulatory perspective and a plaintiff's lawyer's perspective, there is no way to argue that it was not your fault, that they had bad controls. So I think, as this concept is developing, I think there's sort of some broad recognition that it's very important to be vetting these vendors early on. And I guess I would ask Linda and Jorge, what's your perception in terms of how organizations that you may have been interacting with are warming up to this idea or starting to develop these kinds of controls? Linda, why don't you go ahead?
I think it's an expectation now. I think most organizations that we're seeing, or where we act as a vendor to someone, at this point, large organizations have a sophisticated and documented approach that they use for vendor assessment. It is our expectation that we will hear from them on an ongoing basis and have to maintain the standards that we've committed to. And then as we engage vendors, we do the same thing. So I've seen an uptick in requests since the promulgation of the final rules for HIPAA and high-tech, and we're continuing to see customers revisiting those issues with us. And likewise, we are revisiting issues with our vendors. I also think every time you see a consent order out of the FTC or a state AG where vendor management is implicated, you have additional opportunities to improve your program and then also to demonstrate that security is a value proposition for your organization by making sure that you are doing everything right, living up to those expectations, and then also putting yourself in a position to demonstrate that. So whether that's developing collateral that is public-facing or actually undertaking outreach to your customers to really to be mindful that vendor management remains a cornerstone. So we see it as just a growing section of our information security program that has to continually be monitored.
Great point. So, what do you say to the, maybe the executive that says, you know what, this is really, we're not really quite big enough to implement such a large program. This is going to slow us down. We're focusing on this for this quarter, and a couple quarters from now we can pick this back up. Jorge, how would you, what's your reaction to sort of that kind of statement if that's what management is kind of communicating?
Yeah, and I've seen that many times, and I think the way that management is doing, they're not getting away from their responsibility, but they're putting contractual agreements in their contracts with the vendor saying, you need to have the following requirements. You need to get an independent audit report. You need to provide the report to us in less than 6 months. You need to allow us to do independent audits if needed. So I think that's the way that they're handling vendors. It is going to be in the contractual agreement.
Have you started to see companies that traditionally wouldn't be thought of as vendors that would need to be managed start to expand into areas where maybe 2 or 3 years ago no one would think about having vendor management be an issue? And an example might be a law firm or something where traditionally there had not been those requirements.
Yes, absolutely. I think one of the main reasons is being cloud computing. Just the whole concept of you being able to provide services to multiple people from different data centers has created that need of better vendor management, knowing where your data is and how you're protecting your data.
Great. Okay. So next we want to talk about who are the stakeholders in vendor management. And this is a very important concept to think about because I think that without the right type of buy-in and support, it's very difficult to have this process continue and be effective. And so I think there's some components that are reflected in these bullet points that I'd like to go over because I think that effective vendor management really requires very strong organizational commitment from the senior executive leadership of the organization because in some instances, this does become challenging, and the way it becomes challenging is it requires, focus in areas that people traditionally may not have been focused in previously. And so anytime you add a secondary or additional element to the negotiating process, the contracting process, the RFP process, people naturally are concerned that you're adding additional work. And so, it's important to identify who are the individuals that need to sort of take up the mantle of adopting good vendor management. And Linda, do you want to comment on sort of who the stakeholders are in this process, who needs to have the proper buy-in?
Sure. I mean, the tone comes from the top down, so you need C-level support to begin with. But I think part of selling the value proposition of vendor management is ensuring that you can do it with minimal business disruption, and you do that by creating a standardized and repeatable process, but one that gives you reliable and actionable information. So once you get the senior buy-in, you need the core competencies of who can help you assess vendor management. I mean, to your earlier question, David, I think vendor management used to largely be a procurement issue, and now you're seeing an expansion of competencies who contribute there. IT, legal, risk management, the technology folks, the subject matter experts for the business, for the product, for the specific vendor market segment that you're looking to participate with. And once you get everyone's contributions up front, of course, people have their day jobs, so you need to be mindful of how you can establish that standardized process, whether it's through a working group that meets periodically. But once you have that process in place and everyone has agreed upon it, then you're in a position to demonstrate the value, but without taking too much time from the other individuals. But to get started, you really need buy-in from the senior levels. Now, for smaller organizations, some laws are mindful of the small business contingency in drafting their laws and allow for a risk assessment and for an appropriate organization. But if you're part of a larger organization, the expectation is that the buy-in comes from the top down, and that necessitates engagement from all levels of personnel and all different types of segments within your own organization.
So just to focus on the next bullet point, I mean, I think there's an element of, independent ownership of some of this, or independent stakeholders, and with this process being led by maybe risk management, legal, or compliance. I mean, what do you think the importance is of maybe having stakeholders be part of a separate and independent organization? And we'll get into governance, but I just want to focus on that for a second. What are your thoughts on sort of independence, Jorge, in sort of the management of this?
So the independence, the stakeholders not necessarily need to be independent, and so many times the vendor management team is part of different business units. It could be your CFO, it could be your chief legal officer, it could be your CIO. What I think it's important is you making sure that there's a process that everyone understands, and it cannot be jumped. That's the main goal. You want to make sure that the system allows you to have exceptions, but all those exceptions need to be documented and understood from a risk perspective.
And Linda, I mean, why do you think it's important that the internal business owner also have a stake in the process?
Well, they're in the best position to understand exactly how this vendor is going to be engaged with your business. So, I mean, the questionnaire will get you a good portion of the way there, but you need someone who has the real-time expertise about what's going to be going on here. And then also that gets them engaged in the process, and it's an opportunity to educate them if they're not yet educated about the value of this and why you need constant monitoring, or at least periodic monitoring of your vendors, and what restrictions you should be putting in place behind the scenes to the extent necessary. Again, going back to that concept of least privilege.
Right, and I think sort of a follow-up to that is also, to answer my own question as well, is also that establishing this ownership at the business level also brings some accountability into the process, because you can't have the business owner not invested from an accountability standpoint in having this contract move through the system. And if within the organization people kind of generally understand that if I haven't appropriately raised this and it hasn't been appropriately vetted, then I might have some responsibility if there's an issue, or we didn't do the things that we needed to do to keep the organization's data secure. So I think creating that ownership piece across the organization is really critical. And then coming sort of full circle back to the internal audit piece, Jorge, how does a vendor management program sort of get audited from your perspective? I mean, what do the stakeholders need to understand about the audit process and the integrity of the program?
So pretty much when you establish your vendor management program, you're managing your risk regarding your vendors. So that's the first thing we're looking for. After they're going to be looking at, do you have formal policies and procedures? What is your decision process for risk rating the vendors? And then we will be looking at what type of documentation you're obtaining before the vendor is approved under your organization. What is the approval process? There's something that is very important is that a business owner should not have the 100% ability to approve the vendor. It should be part of the risk-based approach. Other people should be part of that decision. So those are the elements that we're looking for. We would be looking at what are you doing on a yearly basis to make sure you're monitoring your vendors, and that could be we could be looking. Are you looking for financial statements? Are you looking for a certificate of insurance of your vendors? Are you looking for the independent audit reports? Are you reviewing all of this information and making a conclusion whether this is a good vendor for your organization or not?
Excellent. So when you start thinking about reaching out to stakeholders, if you're trying to develop this process, is there a role for audit in sort of the initiation and creation of a program like this? And if so, what is that role?
Yeah, the role like internal audit should be part of the process in the sense that they can give their opinion on best practices, what could be done, what cannot be done. But internal audit should always be independent in the sense they should not be a stakeholder in the process because then they will not be able to audit themselves. But I think you should bring your internal audit group because they're going to bring best practices.
Excellent. I want to talk next about sort of overall the governance process, and that's sort of been an underlying theme kind of throughout the presentation up until this point. But I want to drill down a little bit more into exactly how the oversight of this program should work and why governance is a key element, and the importance of oversight and the control mechanism established by the organization. Linda, can you speak just briefly for a little bit about governance in general of the program and why it's important and what are the elements that the governance piece plays?
Sure. Governance, I think, overall just makes sure that you're making deliberate decisions or granting deliberate exceptions in a way that's mindful of the risk that's presented. And I always think of it as you want to make sure there's someone accountable. So accountability, visibility, and defensibility of what's going on. So you want to make sure that at the different levels of the organization, people are appropriately briefed on what's going on and can engage on the risk or choose not to. But that also is predicated on the idea of understanding the risks that attach to different types of data and different data flows. So it turns on where the information comes from and what the particular level of data is, and then how that is going to be passed around, if at all. So once you have the real facts and understand the legal implications, you can bring within the governance model the decisioning about what risks are appropriate and what risks are not to be undertaken. So you want to, though, in that process so that when Jorge comes on site, you have a model in place that is defensible about how you have undertaken these risks and what compensating controls you've built into that process. And throughout that process, again, you want to engage stakeholders who bring a diversity of opinion, but also who can make the decisions and undertake the risk. So you need decision makers, but you also need contributors who bring the subject matter expertise so that the decision makers have the right information to base their decisions on.
Jorge, do you want to comment or follow up on Linda's comments at all?
Yes, there's something that sometimes when you're trying to come up with this decision or criteria, sometimes it's good if you can quantify how much are you willing to, quote unquote, like lose if something happens. Because sometimes just putting a number behind your framework will help you make decisions. A lot of times these frameworks are more, this is high, medium, or low risk, or there's the likelihood that something could happen. But if you try to quantify the process and quantify your impact, it would help you in your decision process.
Excellent. Right. So, and I think, the governance process is really important because, again, it gets back to establishing sort of the scope of your program and the scale. And there needs to be an independent and separate group that can make the decision about what's appropriate and what's not. And those decisions really need to be documented and understood. So in the event that there is an issue, there is a breach, there's a good record of how that determination was made internally that's hopefully subject to the privilege, so it can provide some guidance in the event of the next issue. And also as you're establishing, I think, policies and procedures and standards for how vendors are going to be engaged, whether they're going to be ultimately approved or rejected. And again, this becomes important because you may not have every contract be able to be, reviewed and a determination made by someone senior or someone outside of the legal department. But when there's a real risk and there needs to be a decision made, there needs to be a mechanism in place to escalate that risk and have some sign-off if, for whatever reason, the business wants to proceed. So, Jorge, what have you seen sort of in your experience where there's been a lack of a governance standard or organizational controls once you've gone in after maybe an incident or where you've seen a breach?
Well, what we've seen is that you're going to have a lot of vendors that are not properly governed or managed, and it is a very easy process for us to understand. You can easily go and get from your accounting package all the list of vendors that you have that are currently paying, and then you can go back to saying, like, do we have formal agreements for all these vendors? Are we properly monitoring all these vendors, and what are the risks that these vendors are putting us at risk from an organization standpoint? So that's what we see, is that there's not a process, not being governed, and there's a lot of vendors that could be putting you at risk.
So I want to talk a little bit about the role that the governance process plays in the event that there's a variance, and how that sort of gets escalated up and sort of what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. Jorge, can you speak to, from an audit perspective, on what a variance might look like and what that means to you from an audit perspective?
What a variance can look like, it could be you need to strategically outsource a specific function because X, Y, and Z reason. And when you go and you do your vendor due diligence, you're going to see that the 5 attributes that you would typically use in order to approve the vendor, you have not been able to achieve the 5. So it could be the financial statements are not being audited, or they don't have an independent audit report. And at that moment, then management needs to come back and determine, okay, this is the reason why we're taking this risk. And at that moment, probably you might want to see if you have to insure that risk or document why you're making that decision.
Linda, did you want to comment on that as well?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, that you need to have those controls built in place and be mindful of those as you work through that process.
Great. I mean, the real risk here, I guess, for the individuals within an organization or maybe within legal or risk management is that, they're being asked to make a decision when it's a critical business function to operate outside of the policy. And puts, first of all, puts the organization in a real bind because you're being forced to sort of make a decision outside of the policy. So the issue is, how do you set up a process that allows you that flexibility, provides accountability and ownership of that decision, and where does that properly belong? And that is really the function of the governance piece, whether that's a committee of representatives from these business units that can make a record of that decision and document why that decision was made and have a good record of that so you don't have people within the organization, being asked to make those decisions. So that takes us through the process of governing vendor management. And I want to move on to integration without disruption. And just this concept generally is, within an organization, sometimes managing the change is difficult. And what you're trying to avoid is, slowing the business down by maybe being overly concerned about risk and trying to find that right balance. So really integrating vendor management into the business process requires that leadership and top-down support, and we've talked about that a little bit. But Linda, I wonder if you can comment about failing to get that buy-in and sort of what that means for the program overall.
Well, it makes it an uphill battle, and I think in some ways it can work counter to your whole concept of taking information security seriously. So it's really critical that you have developed, prior to even getting to the vendor management piece, but a culture within your organization that takes this seriously and embraces the concept of privacy and information security. So to the extent that there's pushback, I think it's an opportunity actually to educate people about why information needs to be protected and why you need to be partnering with vendors to ensure that they have those protections in place. Again, that's a cultural setting or a cultural challenge, and top-down support is critical. And to the extent that that gives you opportunities to shore up your own processes, you should embrace those as well. But I think that if there is discord or there is a contingent that doesn't value vendor management, you need to look at it from the bigger picture, from the picture of how do you educate people about information security and demonstrate why information assets are important and why brick and mortar is not the model any longer, or to the extent that it is, there is an equivalent risk setting in electronic commerce.
I mean, is there sort of a perfect world where there is this integration without disruption? I mean, is that a fallacy, or can that exist, do you think? I mean, the way that business people hold on to the agility of the contracting process is something that's pretty sacred, and I'm just wondering if you think that there is the ability to get to that perfect place where this works in harmony and unison for folks that may think that just doesn't exist.
Where we're all singing Kumbaya. I think that comes as your process matures. I think initially people have to roll up their sleeves. They have to dedicate some time outside of their day job to get the process that someone like Jorge is going to come in and test, to get that process up and running. And on an ongoing basis, there will be work that has to be done to assess those vendors. So that may mean that your governance model meets on a quarterly basis or a monthly basis, whatever is appropriate, but to reduce the time that it takes away from people. But I think you want to ensure that people's expertise continues to be a contribution to your program. But I think as you bring some discipline to that program, as Jorge said, either doing it through a scoring methodology or a red light, green light methodology, but so that people can create repeatable and defensible decisions. And through that process, the education piece continues. So
Great point.
I think that there is going to be a tension. I mean, it is not necessarily a revenue-producing endeavor, but it is a revenue and reputational defending endeavor as well. But to the extent that you engage vendors, it also becomes part of your value proposition. People don't want to entrust you with information now if they don't feel that it's going to be safe. And engaging vendors at any level can create a risk that you need to be accounting for and you need to be accountable for, and able to demonstrate throughout your relationships with your customers, with regulators, whoever the third party may be, that you have a process for doing that. So yes, it takes time, but it's a very important endeavor.
I mean, Jorge, have we gotten to the point where it becomes very, very difficult to not adopt something like this? I mean, can businesses go on as usual and sort of ignore these concepts from your view? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think business have two options. They have the option of embracing these now and start making changes and changing the culture year by year, or sometimes what I've seen, which is the integration with disruption, which is a data breach occurs at a third party, and then it becomes a requirement and it's mandated across the board that there has to be some type of vendor management. So I think those are your two options, and that's what we're seeing. It's going to be one or the other, and I think it's up to the business to determine which road they want to go through.
That's an excellent point, and it occurs to me that maybe we should have had a slide that said integration with disruption, and maybe we can talk just for a second about that, because I think the point you're making is that once the breach happens, you sort of lose the ability to control this process. It will not be on your timetable, and it will not be within your budget, right? It'll be very much the opposite, and it could very well be under some regulatory supervision, which would be the worst case scenario. So I think your point's well taken that the elements of control are really important, and so the sooner that you can initiate this process and get some buy-in, the more likely you are to avoid integration with disruption. And I think that sums up the next bullet point well. And I think to the extent that you have people within the organization saying maybe this is not a good use of time or it's too expensive, that you really can't monetize the effective program. You can only monetize the ineffective program as a result of the risk that's occurred or the results of the program being ineffective. So can you talk, I guess, Linda or Jorge, about what you've seen in terms of education and training and communication, either within your own organization or other organizations, and how sort of the message gets out without being disruptive? Have you seen some strategies of how organizations have done that effectively?
I mean, for us, it goes back to, again, creating and adhering to documented and repeatable processes so that you drive the behavior and you identify the points where vendors could be interacting with your company and you're not aware. Maybe that's finance. Maybe that's the person at the front door who greets people as they come in. But identifying those entry points and making sure that there's education about what your process is going to be. And hopefully, of course, your process has been developed with buy-in from the different contingencies within the company. So I think that you have to be mindful that there are always new vendors who you may want to engage and old vendors who may need to be retired from working with you. So, I mean, to your earlier point, David, about, that the breach is a catastrophic event, yes, it is. But on an ongoing basis, you want to examine vendors for noncompliance before you get to that point, of course. So that of course, necessitates education and awareness, which comes from an overall culture that is sensitive to privacy and information security concerns through training, through repeated education, through repeated touch points, and through C-level support on down.
That's a great point, and I'm glad you made it, that this really is, it's a live process. And because a contract may be 10 years old or 15 years old, that doesn't necessitate the need to really put it through this process maybe again. Because your risks are constantly evolving and changing, and what was okay some time ago may no longer be acceptable. So that's a great point. Moving on to vendor management and key legal compliance and contractual components. Linda, I wonder if you maybe will take the first part about this and talk about sort of the importance of subject matter expertise in this area.
Sure, and I'm potentially talking myself out of a job in some ways, but I would say that legal is at the table, but they're not the first ones there. The law is always catching up with the information security trends and the threat paradigms that we see. So I think the subject matter experts have to be people who are tuned in to both the vendor options. I mean, what are the spectrum of choices you have, and how do these vendors engage? How do these vendors control the risk on their side? But also the people who can bring to bear the risks or an understanding of the risks that are presented specific to your organization. So those will be the people who are part of your product development team, the people who are part of your information infrastructure protection team. It may be someone from your insurance group who mitigates for those risks that can't be mitigated for through the other controls you put in place. So it depends on your organization. For some organizations, it's a dedicated risk management team that already has those competencies built in. For some organizations, it's going to be a larger team that reaches across the business units and then within those corporate functions, in-house legal, in-house audit. And it may also be that you bring someone like Jorge into that initial discussion. The outside auditor's perspective is always very valuable. You also may want to engage your government affairs team, the people who are going to have their pulse on the changes, as well as the real security people, boots on the ground, who are going to understand the new threat paradigms and how you can account for those.
Excellent. Right. So, and really this does become a question of, sort of what are the resources within your organization? I mean, do you have the people that can do this sort of assessment early on, that have the background and the expertise to get these provisions into the transaction, that can ask the right questions to the vendors to make sure that those elements are included as part of the original agreement, and that they have clear definitions around sort of the issues that may present themselves. the second part of the slide is vendor compliance and sort of the things that you'll be asking at a high level the vendor to do. I guess, Linda, requiring that vendor to represent and warrant compliance with all the laws that may be applicable to personal information. There may be lots of vendors out there that don't have responsibility or are not required to comply with those laws. How do you sort of balance what a vendor may or may not be required to do from a legal standpoint, and then asking them, to rep in the agreement that they'll abide by all the laws that apply to you with respect to your information? Have you seen that, or how have you handled that in your experience?
I think you have to get real granular about what specific data is being passed here and what laws apply and what your expectations are. And you got to consider the domestic context, the international context, things like data transfer rules may be in play. And to do that, you really need to understand your vendor. That goes back to the other point of, as part of your vendor vetting process, understanding what the landscape of options are. Can you get a cloud provider who will sign a business associate agreement? Yes. Okay. So then, do you eliminate from the running those vendors who can't be part of those requirements that you have? So you want to be mindful both of the restrictions that are in the marketplace, but then also the legal things that are must comply versus may comply. So as you evaluate your own internal requirements, you need to have legal at the table, you need to have information security at the table, you need to have your auditors at the table, and understand that the legal requirements, yes, you can have the catch-all phrase of must comply with all applicable laws, but in doing something at just that broad of a level, are you missing the opportunity to really explore what those legal obligations are and to have the conversation with the vendor? It may be that they won't agree to a contractual representation because it's not something they can comply with from a legal perspective. There's always room for discussions about things like the indemnification, the limitations of liability, the insurance coverage, things that attach after the relationship is established. But in terms of the legal compliance, I think that's a threshold matter. So I think it's important to be as detailed as possible in what your expectations are and to identify in conjunction with your vendor what data you intend to be sharing or what access rights you intend to be providing them. So using protected health information as an example again, with the promulgation of final rules, the flow down to sub-business associates of those obligations is quite clear. So that's not something to hide the ball on. You want to be very upfront with your vendors, again, using that as just one example, about whether or not they have controls in place to account for the obligations of the security rule and the privacy rule. So I don't think it's something to shy away from. I think you always want to have that catch-all phrase,
sure,
but to be as granular as possible.
Jorge, is it unreasonable for an organization to ask the vendor to comply with the organization's privacy and information assurance policies in your view?
I don't think it's unreasonable to ask them to comply with the framework. I think it's unreasonable to ask them to comply with your own policy and procedures. And the main reason why is because as a company, you've developed your own policy and procedures based on your security needs, based on your business model. So I think what you want to do is try to establish a common framework that both organizations are comfortable, and it's a framework that could be audited, and when you get a report, you understand what you're looking for.
Excellent. So moving on into these other elements, what about the security programs? Should the vendor be required to maintain its own privacy and information security program and have risk assessments of its security practices? Jorge, are you seeing your clients make sure that vendors do have that in place, and are they asking you to audit that?
Yes, absolutely. I think, and it goes back to, it all depends on your regulatory requirement. If you are in the HIPAA or GLBA, they should already be doing that. So it's already there. I think what we're not necessarily seeing, and I recommend to my clients, it is how you monitoring that they're actually doing that. And the question is just as simple as, like, have you requested their latest audit report or security report, and what were the findings? So I think we're seeing more of those. There's still a lot of confusion of what that means.
Okay. And then I guess how important is it from your perspective that the vendor be able to provide notification? And I guess what have you seen in terms of those types of clauses and the ability of vendors to sort of respond back in the event of a breach or just the negotiation of those provisions, Linda or Jorge?
I mean, from our perspective, it depends on which role we're in as a vendor or contracting with someone to be our vendor. I mean, of course, the most advantageous position to be in is to retain control over any breach notices that go and to be able to have full visibility to the investigation and to really make sure it's a partnership between the two entities that are involved. There are some backup positions, of course, that you can take depending on the risk of the transaction, who's getting what data. But I think, to your point, David, you want to account for those things before you're in that situation. There may be some deals that are such a high revenue that you're willing to take more risk, but to the extent that you can establish those roles up front, it's helpful. I mean, one thing that is an example of that is public statements. I mean, do you want to negotiate who makes a public statement, who approves a public statement? Do you want to contemplate ahead of time? And I think the answer is yes. How a data breach could play out. Are you going to indemnify for regulatory sanctions? Are you going to handle consumer notices? Do you include credit monitoring? So going through on a very detailed level what you're going to do. And to Jorge, the earlier point about that you can't necessarily expect them to adopt your practices, I think that that's right. I mean, you have to be mindful that every entity is going to have, hopefully, their data breach playbook and how that's handled. So just understanding, again, in a very detailed level, what your vendor's data playbook looks like and whether or not that's a risk that you can take or if there's no risk attached. I mean, I think it's something you factor into your initial vendor management and analysis process.
Excellent. Jorge, some of these contract provisions allow the corporation to go onto the property of the vendor and conduct their own audit, give the corporation audit rights to the vendor, or the right to hire their own third party to conduct the audit. Can you just talk a little bit about what that experience is like and sort of what the dynamic is when you're coming in on behalf of a company to their vendor?
Yeah, so on that specific statement, I've seen that clause more when the vendor does not necessarily have an independent audit report like a SA-16 or a SOC report. So it's the way of negotiating, saying, listen, I cannot really afford going through an SA-16, but if you want, you can come and audit me. So I think that's been one of those negotiation practices that I've seen when the vendors cannot necessarily go through an independent audit report. And typically what you do is goes back to you need to understand what is the risk that the vendor is posing to your organization. And if it's a privacy risk, then you develop a privacy audit program to determine whether they're following the privacy practices. Are you concerned about information not being properly backed up? So you need to develop a specific audit program just to help you manage the risk that vendor has been assigned or identified.
Excellent. So getting into sort of more of the indemnification and liability, Linda, what do you think about the capability of third parties to be able to provide sort of broad-based indemnification for failure to comply or loss of data or negligence or breach, just generally?
I think the ability is there. I think it depends on the revenue presented and the kinds of content that are being exchanged. I think it also is important as cyber liability coverage expands to build that into your risk mitigation model in the contract. Of course, there are certain entities, governmental, et cetera, that can't offer those protections. Then you have to make the business risk about how you mitigate from there, whether that means data minimization or access restrictions. I think it's all part of the bigger picture of how you select your vendor and what risks you think are appropriate for the situation.
Great. And then I think the confidentiality provisions in the agreement sort of speak for themselves and sort of self-explanatory in terms of why that's important and what that means. Moving on to what I think is the most exciting part of the presentation, where I think there's a little bit of need to sort of clarify some of these different reports and what they mean. I want to turn it over to Jorge to kind of walk us through what these controls are, what these reports are, and why they're important. And Jorge, could you give us a breakdown of SOC reports and how they're used?
Absolutely. So first of all, the SOC reports is the result of getting rid of what used to be called the SAS 70. And that used to be the audit report that was in place by the AICPA for a couple of years. But because the SAS 70 was being used for multiple functions or to help you manage multiple risks, the AICPA decided to say, you know what, we need to break these reports into reports that really help you manage your risk. So they created these SOC reports, which is primarily two reports, which is called the SOC 1 or the SSA 16, and then the other report, which is called the SOC 2 report. Now, the SSA 16 or SOC 1 report, which used to be the SAS 70, is primarily for financial controls. So if you need to comply for Sarbanes-Oxley, these are the typical reports that you'll be looking for. Primarily, you're looking at financial integrity. If your risk is, if you're providing data to a third party, the third party is doing some type of calculations that you're going to be using for your financial statements, how do you know that that data is correct? Now, what I think it's been great from an industry perspective, it is the different SOC 2 reports that are available. Under the SOC 2 reports, there's different trust service principles. And what does that mean? It is that you can pick one or multiple of those principles and you can issue a SOC 2 report. And I'll explain what the actual reports mean. But from a topic perspective, you have security, you have availability, you have process integrity, you have confidentiality, and you have privacy. So what is important when you're going back to your vendor management program is identify what is the risk that that vendor is posing to you guys. So if it's security, so then the audit report that you should be looking for is a security audit report. Or if it's privacy, you should be looking for the privacy SOC 2 report. So it is very important for you to understand your risk to be able to match that risk to the independent audit reports. Now,
just to jump in real quick with a question, I mean, have you seen confusion within, the industry or with vendors in terms of interchanging these two, or maybe not understanding the distinction between the two? And is a one appropriate where you might need a two, and vice versa? Can you speak to that just really quickly?
Yes, absolutely. There's been a lot of confusion, and I'll try to not confuse you guys with the following, but there's something which is called the Type 1 and the Type 2 reports. Which means that Type 1, it is a report that you tested as of a period of time, and when you do the Type 2 is for a period of time. And I'll explain that. I'll give you an example. So if your concern is physical security, so you decided to say, okay, your vendor needs to get a SOC 2 report on a Type 2 for security. That means that me as the auditor, I'm going to go back for the past 6 months and audit that vendor to make sure that they have good security practices. So typically when you're looking at these audit reports, you're going to be looking at a detailed description of what the vendor's practices are, and then you're going to be looking at the way that the auditor tested those practices.
Excellent. So I guess that takes us to the next slide.
So yeah, in the next slide, really what I think it's important, and I've seen this many times in which we get a client that is telling us that they're in the process of closing a deal, and one of the agreements is that they need to get a SOC 2 report. But they don't necessarily specify what type of SOC 2 report it is, and it is up to sometimes the client, who in this case is the vendor, try to go back and make sure that they clarify what is their requirements and what is the risk that they believe they're posing to that customer. And depending on your service or your business line, you're going to have different requirements. You're going to have different risks. And that's why the SOC 1, you might have that it would apply to a payroll service provider, but the same would apply to a SOC 2. It would be a payroll service provider as well. However, a cloud provider might just need to get a SOC 2 from a privacy perspective, but they wouldn't need to get a SOC 1. So it is important for you to understand what is the risk and what is the right independent audit report that you can use.
I'm glad you mentioned cloud provider because I want to just give a quick overview because we're about an hour and 15 minutes, and I want to maybe save some time for some questions if there are any questions. And can you speak a little bit to what the organization should be considering and what they should investigate in terms of risk when they're outsourcing? And I know this is a huge topic that could probably have an entire segment devoted to it, but can you kind of walk us through the risks in outsourcing to a cloud provider?
Absolutely. So one of the biggest issues with cloud is you can easily afford a cloud provider easier than it is cheaper, just to say it. And that means that it's easier for you to get into a contract with a third-party provider. Sometimes you just need a credit card, and you just need to upload your information, and the cloud provider is going to start providing you with the service. So by doing that, you're going to have a lot of the issues of where is that data being transferred to? Is it being kept in the United States? Is it being sent to other countries? If you have some type of subpoena process, how is that going to be handled? What is their destruction procedures if you have sensitive information that eventually when you know they need it, you want to make sure that that company is destroying that information as per your requirements. So I think the risks are more electronic risks. And I would be careful with cloud in the sense that it's a huge benefit for the business, but it comes with a lot of risk. That doesn't mean that cloud is bad. Cloud is good. You just need to make sure that you have the right vendor.
Linda, do you have any comment on sort of risks with outsourcing to a cloud provider in terms of your own experience or what you may have heard from colleagues outside of your organization or anywhere else?
I mean, I think the general feedback is that it goes back to the core vendor assessment, being really granular with the details and understanding what risks you can accept or not. And within that process, understanding that there may be some real legal barriers to what you're working on, whether that's data transfer, whether it's a cloud provider that has challenges with regard to becoming a business associate. But again, I think to Jorge's point and to yours, it's taking the deep dive and getting a lot of details before you make those decisions.
Excellent. So I think it's a good point now that we maybe kind of run through the practical takeaways and sort of give a finishing overview to the presentation. And just to sum up, really the goal of the presentation was to give enough sort of information and data to be able to start to initiate this program on your own and to identify a lot of these issues. And so I want to walk through some of what the practical takeaways are after you've built that executive support and the business case to begin to move forward with doing a vendor management program. So step one is you want to be able to conduct a full inventory and accounting of all third-party vendors, those vendors that have access to or receive data from the organization. And when we say full inventory and accounting, that may be going back sometime throughout the organization. Jorge, you alluded to some ways that might be a good start to try and gather some of this data, and I'd like you to maybe just repeat those really quickly in terms of how you initiate this process.
Definitely. What I was saying before is like you can go to your accounting package and get a list of all your active vendors. And from there, you have a starting point.
Are most people prioritizing those in terms of dollars spent or size? I mean, once you have that list, I mean, I guess what's the first thing to think about from a risk perspective? Is it a data analysis? Is it a cost analysis? I mean, what's your view on that? And Linda, feel free to jump in with that as well.
Yeah, I would think I would have to go to Linda on that. It all depends on the access of the data they have. So do they own the data, do they store the data, or they just simply have access to the data, and that will start driving your risk.
Great. So, step two as part of the takeaways is you've got to start engaging the appropriate stakeholders to identify vendors and to, contribute to establishing this program. Once that inventory is complete, the process really has to be put in place to ensure that the organization can really implement a risk assessment process and can get this foundation for engaging future third-party vendors established. And finally, organizations should consider hiring to the extent that they need both internal and external experts to align some of these groups like legal, IT, and information assurance and seek outside guidance where necessary and is appropriate to help bring this program together and have it start to be functioning in an effective way. And finally, a really critical point that we spent some time talking about is organizations should consider designating an executive owner and sponsor to engage senior management and potentially the organization's board of directors. The governance process can't be, and sort of buy-in, stakeholder buy-in can't be overemphasized. And finally, one recommendation is that as part of that governance process and management process, that the steering committee or appropriate governance model be engaged that can direct how the business owners participate as part of this process, how variance reviews are done, and so that there's management support in helping this process develop. And Linda or Jorge, do you have anything to add to the takeaways? So that is the bulk of the presentation, and I'm just going to go to some questions to see if there's some questions in the queue. One of the questions comes to us. In lieu of performing a deep dive due diligence review of a vendor, how advisable is it to rely in whole or in part on that vendor's SSC 16 report? Jorge, do you want to take that?
Yes, absolutely. So I think that's a good way. It's a good way for you to identify your vendors that have an independent audit report. Now, what you still have to ask yourself is if the SSA 16 is good enough for you from the risk perspective. Many times you might have a company that has multiple SSA 16s because they have different products, or maybe they have different other SOC reports. So it's important for you to read the report and identify whether the report it is addressing the function that you are outsourcing.
Great. Our next question is, are any of you seeing vendors try to pass off SOC 1 in lieu of or in place of a SOC 2? This is part of the question. The organization I work for has encountered this, and there seems to be resistance to obtaining SOC 2. What is suggested when the vendor refuses to, fails or refuses to share a SOC 2? Jorge, that might be one for you as well.
I'll take that one as well. So I think what happens here is you as an organization, you have identified a risk that needs to be managed through a SOC 2 report, and your vendor is coming back to you and saying, I'm not getting that report. It's up to you to determine whether it's time for you to look for another vendor, or you're willing to accept the risk that that vendor does not have a SOC 2. And it goes back to your governance program, how you're documenting the risk, how you accepting the risk, and or are you mitigating the risk by maybe adding additional contractual agreements, and maybe that's when you need to bring legal to the table to see how you can manage your risk.
Another question is, how are we defining vendors? Is this really only related to IT vendors for the purposes of the presentation? And I would say that the answer to that is no. This is really any vendor that's getting customer data, employee data, or intellectual property data. And Linda, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think you want to build that into your initial questionnaire so that you understand what access points there are and whether certain portions of the questionnaire are just not applicable. But my suggestion is that it's not limited in that way, that you create a repeatable, standardized process that accounts for the different interactions you might have with a vendor.
Great. So Kathleen, that concludes the question and answer portion, and I will take the presentation back to you. I did see some comments on the question side about the CLE code, sort of the second part being mentioned again, so I'll just bring that to your attention. But I'd like to thank Linda and Jorge for an excellent presentation and some great information. It's really been my pleasure, and I hope this presentation was useful to everyone listening, and I thank everybody for their time and attention this afternoon.
David, this is Kathleen. I would just ask if you could take a moment and review the Q&A tab one more time. I see a number of questions, and I'm unsure that they were addressed in the presentation. And I would just remind all of our attendees today that we are scheduled to complete the webinar at 3:35 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay.
David, perhaps you and Linda and Jorge could discuss some of the issues that perhaps you felt you did not have enough time to address in the presentation. I just want to ensure for CLE purposes that we are compliant with our time.
So let me refresh the question section and see if there's some additional questions.
And I can answer that. There was one question that came in about requiring a vendor to comply with your company's policy and commenting on the indemnification approach as well. I think one thing is, as as you look at the expectations you have of a vendor, you want to be flexible in understanding what their responses are, but trying to map those responses and those controls to your framework. So I agree that you can't tell your vendor that they have to receive your training, but if they have something that is materially similar to your training, you should at least consider that. Or perhaps for your framework control about training, you articulate the 10 things that their training has to be inclusive of. And if it's not, you take a look at whether or not that's something you can't handle. In terms of the indemnification, my point in mentioning indemnification was it's a great thing to get more indemnification if the data you're passing off is more sensitive and the vendor has more visibility. But I certainly don't think that a vendor would take on risks that are incongruous with the data transfers or the access that they're having. And I didn't mean to suggest that. I'm saying it's something to factor in your risk analysis of the vendor itself. So if you have two equivalent vendors and one's going to give you more indemnification, that may be the person you go with. But again, I think that the contract and the vendor examination, the vendor management is where you want to sort those out to make sure that you're completely clear about the risk that you're undertaking, and you can work through your governance model to see if that is a risk that's appropriate.
What about the indemnification piece? I mean, this question has come up. The suggested approach to indemnification would convert a vendor into an insurance broker. It's hard to see any savvy vendor agreeing to that indemnity. I mean, what has been the sort of reaction that you've seen in the environment in which you've been negotiating about a vendor's willingness to indemnify for a breach or for a loss of data? I mean, is that something you've seen as sort of becoming more common, or do you have scars from those discussions, or I guess
I mean, I think it's an interesting point that any vendor becomes an insurance broker, but in large part, lots of corporations have insurance for lots of risks. So I think that the risks that are presented through the information you're providing to your vendor need to be accounted for in the insurance coverage. So, for example, if you're giving someone access to your physical premises and you're worried about theft, do they have coverage for their own employee theft issues, and are you someone who would benefit from that coverage? So my point is not to turn someone into an insurance broker, but to factor that into your vendor assessment process so you understand what risks you are undertaking by engaging them.
Yeah, I think just to follow up on that, I mean, that's a great point, because by the time that you're negotiating indemnification, you should already have a very well-developed sense of what your risks are, and if you've done the vendor management process correctly, you're going to know very early on sort of the maturity and the ability of the party in which you're contracting with to handle the risk. And so that's the very point of why this process is important. You don't want to get to the 11th hour of the contract, be negotiating this clause, and find out that they don't have the ability or the willingness to accept responsibility for the risks that you've identified early on. So let me see if there are any additional questions. One of the things that I think is very interesting, and maybe Jorge, you can comment on this, is whether as attorneys are drafting these contracts, if these audit provisions need to be expanded to really include more detail about what's required in audit reports, and what is the result within a 6-month time period or a year time period if a report comes back. What are the remedies that may be available in terms of the contract? I mean, from your perspective from the audit side, are these provisions sufficient, and how would you suggest maybe attorneys consider adding additional safeguards on the audit side? What are the key elements that you think should probably start to be included in these agreements?
So one of the things is we've seen in the agreement, it is still like vague, saying, hey, you need to get an independent audit report, but they don't go into the detail of identifying what the specific audit report, what are the requirements of the report. And many times the vendor can take advantage of that by saying, you asked me to get a SOC 2 report, and I did a SOC 2 report that doesn't apply to you. So I do think that there has to be, and it goes back to that's the part of the vendor management process, really understanding what is the risk of that vendor. And if you can have the time to discuss internally with your group what is the risk and document that into your agreement, I think it's just going to help you in the long run. So I think that is something that's important and should be done. And I foresee we will start be getting better at that, maybe in a year, 2 years, since the reports are so new. So there's still a lot of confusion, but I think we're getting better. Now, there was something that I've encountered, and I've seen it resolved different ways. And it's more like a question for you, David. I don't know what's your approach, but sometimes when you go back and you start doing your vendor management program and you identify, for example, that you have 30 vendors, and out of the 30 vendors, some of those will pose some type of risk to you from a data perspective. How do you do an addendum to the contract? Do you ask them to do a non-disclosure agreement in which they require you to notify you back? That's been kind of like a question that I get asked by my clients. And
sure.
like,
no, I mean, I think the best case scenario is that the parties are willing to agree to some type of addendum to the contract, and that creates an interesting opportunity if it's sort of out of the blue and you're contacting the vendor to maybe open up the agreement for renegotiation. And so if that becomes problematic, then maybe the time to do it is during a renewal or at some period where there's a natural turnover to the agreement, because these issues they're complex and they involve some negotiation, and the other side may just not be willing to sign an addendum in this area. And so if it's an older agreement, I mean, this is also a good opportunity to sort of go through your existing relationships and sort of evaluate them from a privacy and security standpoint. And sometimes as organizations grow, they outgrow the effectiveness of some of their vendors. If somebody's been processing your marketing data and it's two guys in a garage because you've had that relationship for 15 years, it may be time in the environment to sort of reconsider that. So, this process forces you, it flushes out sort of all of those long-standing agreements and requires, everybody to kind of take a second look and think about, how those factor in. Linda, there's a question in the queue about cyber security insurance to these scenarios, and I want to sort of briefly give my view of that, and then I would love to hear sort of what you are thinking. And I find generally that sort of the market on cyber security insurance is maturing as well, and that organizations traditionally have not specified that type of coverage, and you typically tend to see breach-related response under E&O, and then again there may be some exclusions to those policies that don't exactly fit scenarios. And I've also found that you really have to make sure that your broker understands sort of the risk and what risks are being covered, and that the underwriters are really properly evaluating the risk, because I think it's different within every industry depending on the environment. And so that process, it's separate from the vendor management process in some regards, but it does require the same type of attention, and it may not always be sort of the best remedy in the event of a breach anyway, depending on how the coverages are organized or arranged. So, Linda, do you have any comments on cyber liability insurance and your experience with that?
I think it's key to understand the exclusions and to understand how your coverage, whether it's tiered coverage, layered coverage, but to understand what the exclusions are when they kick in, and to be mindful of the impact of a data breach and what deductibles you may have.
Excellent.
David, on that point, when we do the vendor audits, we look at insurance, and I think it might be good practice from a vendor management perspective. When you're doing your due diligence, do they have a certificate of insurance? Is it updated? And are you including cybersecurity, especially as it relates to your vendors and to your employees? So I think it's a good best practice to have as part of your vendor due diligence and monitoring procedures is active or not.
Excellent. As we're finishing up sort of in the remaining moments of the presentation, Linda or Jorge, is there anything else you'd like to add? Or Linda, if you have sort of the QA up, I lost mine for a second, but now it's back. I'm just sort of seeing if there are any other things we haven't. Some of the basic elements to a vendor management policy. Linda, I don't know if you want to sort of talk about that. What are the basic elements? A lot of that
Sure.
We've covered today.
I think that pivots off of your questionnaire, being mindful of what are the shoulds versus the musts, and in that policy being mindful of the business unit needs. So, we talk about sometimes you could have perfect security, but you wouldn't have any revenue. But there's a middle ground between that and taking unacceptable risks. So I think the policy wants to probably attach the questionnaire, or at least the key sections of the questionnaire, so your policy addresses the types of risks or information or considerations that you want to factor in, and also addresses the governance model for exceptions or for just standard decisions to be made.
Yeah, I think the other sort of key component is to consider is versioning. As the policy changes or matures or different risks start to be addressed, that it's really important that you maintain version control of that policy, and that the variance process be documented as part of that policy too, to know when exceptions may apply, and that that's documented well. And then, the business owners and the stakeholders are clearly outlined, who has organizational authority, governance authority for the policy. So I think we are right at the time, Kathleen, unless I'm wrong about that. I think we have a few more seconds, so I will turn it back to you.
Thank you so much. Attendees, I'd like to announce today's second CLE code. Please take note. The second CLE code for today's webinar is 5915. Again, the second CLE code for today's webinar is 5915. And on behalf of LexisNexis, I would like to thank David, Jorge, and Linda for an outstanding program today. To our audience, thank you for attending today's complimentary webinar. We ask that you please follow the link to our survey. Your feedback on products and services is an excellent resource for us. Thank you all, and have a great day.